This, of course, came as a huge shock, and William and I have been doing everything we can to process and manage this privately for the sake of our young family. As you can imagine, this has taken time.
Camilla breaks down in tears as William and Catherine confirm Charles' marriage was far nastier. Okay, stay with me, because that title is not simply about another royal disagreement, another recycled argument about Charles, Diana, and Camilla. The claim at the center of this story is far more personal. William and Catherine are said to have confronted a painful version of Charles and Diana's marriage that goes beyond the polished photographs, the public speeches, and the carefully remembered history. And when that account allegedly reached Camilla, the reaction was said to be immediate and deeply emotional. Now, watch this carefully. The reason this matters right now is not because Charles and Diana's marriage was ever presented as perfect. Everyone already knows it was troubled. The startling part is the suggestion that William, one of the children who actually lived through its final years, may now be willing to acknowledge just how severe that conflict felt from inside the family. If that is the position being discussed, then this is no longer simply a story about the past. It is a story about who gets to define that past. The alleged confrontation is therefore bigger than Camilla crying. It places William and Catherine on one side of a question that the royal family has spent decades navigating carefully. What really happened inside that marriage when the cameras disappeared? What did William see? What did he remember? And what has remained unsaid, because saying it could reopen wounds that never completely healed? Those questions are what make this account so explosive. Hi viewers, if you believe William should be allowed to speak honestly about what he experienced as a child, would you stand with him? Simply comment yes if you think the truth should never be buried, just because it makes powerful people uncomfortable. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, leave that comment now, because silence is exactly what allows old versions of history to survive unchallenged. Take a look at the moment at the center of the claim. There is no need for shouting to make a royal confrontation dangerous. Sometimes the most serious palace disputes begin quietly, with a name mentioned, a memory challenged, and a question nobody in the room wants to answer. Charles, Diana, William, and then Camilla, 4 names connected by a history that has been examined for decades, yet still carries enough emotional weight to change the atmosphere whenever it is brought back into the room. According to the account behind this story, William was not simply repeating something he had heard from another person. He was allegedly revisiting the way his parents' conflict affected him and Harry when they were young. That distinction matters. A newspaper story can be dismissed. A commentator can be ignored. But the memories of the children who lived through the breakdown of a marriage carry a different kind of weight. And Catherine's alleged role makes the situation even more significant. She is presented not as someone standing outside the dispute, but as someone supporting William while he confronts a chapter that has followed him for most of his adult life.
That BBC employees lied and used fake documents to obtain the interview with my mother, made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia, displayed woeful incompetence when investigating complaints and concerns about the programme, and were evasive in their reporting to the media and covered up what they knew from their internal investigation.
That does not prove every allegation surrounding the marriage. It does, however, explain why the story has such a powerful emotional center. William would not merely be discussing 2 historical figures, he would be discussing his parents. Then comes the part that reportedly changed the atmosphere completely. The discussion allegedly moved beyond the familiar public description of an unhappy royal marriage. It turned toward the possibility that the hostility, tension, and emotional damage inside the relationship had been considerably more intense than the public version conveyed. The phrase itself is what gives this story its force, far nastier. Those words do not need to mean that every rumor about Charles and Diana was true. They do not prove every private allegation ever printed. What they suggest, if the account is accurate, is something much more difficult to dismiss. that William's personal memory of the marriage may contain a level of pain that the official language surrounding the family never fully captured. And that is where Camilla becomes impossible to separate from the story. For years, the public has known that Camilla's relationship with Charles became one of the defining elements of the breakdown of his marriage to Diana. But a renewed discussion about what William remembers would inevitably place that history under a different light. It would not only ask what Charles and Diana did to one another, it would ask what their children absorbed while those battles were unfolding around them. That is a very different question. It moves the story away from gossip and toward memory. It also explains why the alleged reaction from Camilla carries such significance. If she was confronted with a version of the past that centered not on public reputation, but on the experience of Charles's children, then defending an old narrative would become much harder. William would be speaking from the position of the son, not the future king. And that is precisely where the tension begins to rise. Because there is another question waiting behind the first one. Why would William and Catherine choose to revisit this now? Why reopen a marriage that ended decades ago? Why bring attention back to the most painful years of William's childhood when the royal family has spent so much time looking forward? And why would a discussion like this reportedly affect Camilla so deeply? The answer, according to the account, may lie in the fact that the past has never really stayed in the past. Diana's legacy remains tied to William's identity. Charles's first marriage remains part of the history surrounding the modern monarchy. And Camilla's place within that history has never been separated completely from the woman who came before her. That means every time William speaks about those years, the conversation carries another shadow with it. Diana, the woman whose death transformed William's childhood forever. The mother whose suffering became part of the public story. And the figure whose relationship with Charles continues to influence how the royal family is viewed decades later. But there is something even more uncomfortable here.
It is my view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what my mother said. The interview was a major contribution to making my parents' relationship worse and has since hurt countless others. It brings indescribable sadness to know that the BBC's failures contributed significantly to her fear, paranoia, and isolation that I remember from those final years with her.
If William is now willing to confirm that the marriage was worse behind closed doors than many people understood, then the real story is not what Camilla allegedly felt in that moment. The real story is what William believes he remembers. Because children notice things adults think they have hidden. They notice silence at dinner. They notice doors closing. They notice when a parent changes the moment another person enters the room. They notice tension that never appears in photographs, and they carry those memories long after the adults have moved on. That is why this alleged confirmation would be so difficult to dismiss as another royal rumor. It would place the story inside William's own memory, and it would force the monarchy to confront something it cannot simply rewrite with a statement or a carefully chosen photograph. For Camilla, that would mean facing a chapter of Charles's life that never disappeared, no matter how many decades passed. For William, it could mean finally refusing to let the public version of his childhood become the only version. And for Catherine, standing beside him would carry its own message. The future of the monarchy may depend on looking forward, but William cannot move forward by pretending that the past never happened. And if this account is only beginning to reveal what he allegedly confirmed, then the tears were not the most shocking part. The most shocking part was what William was reportedly prepared to say next. So, if you have stayed this long, do not scroll away now, because the next part goes deeper into the marriage William actually grew up inside, and once that door opens, the story becomes far more uncomfortable than the headline suggests. The wedding photographs were perfect, the marriage was not. That distinction matters, because the story William is now alleged to be confronting did not begin with Camilla, And it did not begin with a single explosive argument. It began with two people being placed inside a system that expected them to perform happiness before they had learned how to build a private life together. On 24 February 1981, Charles and Diana announced their engagement. He was 32, she was 19. He was already the heir to the throne, trained for a future that had been mapped out since childhood. She was a young woman, stepping into an institution whose rules were older than anyone in her generation. Their engagement immediately became a national spectacle, and the pressure did not wait for the wedding. They married on 29 July 1981.
As is the love, support and kindness that has been shown by so many of you. It means so much to us both. We hope that you'll understand that as a family, we now need some time, space and privacy.
At St. Paul's Cathedral, millions watched. The ceremony looked like the beginning of a fairy tale, but the public image concealed an obvious problem. The couple were not simply getting married. They were becoming a national symbol, and every private difficulty would eventually collide with that role. Diana entered royal life with enormous attention around her. She was young, photogenic, and immediately capable of drawing crowds on a scale that surprised the institution around her. That popularity became important because it changed the balance inside a relationship already carrying enormous expectations. The 1983 tour of Australia and New Zealand exposed that change in a way neither of them could easily ignore. Crowds gathered around Diana with extraordinary enthusiasm. Charles was still the heir, still the man the institution had trained the public to recognize as its future king, but the attention repeatedly moved toward his young wife. For Diana, the attention was not simply flattering, it came with pressure she had never experienced before. For Charles, the reaction reportedly became another source of strain. The problem was not that either person had deliberately created the situation. The problem was that the institution had suddenly placed two very different personalities under a level of public scrutiny that left almost no room for ordinary adjustment. By the middle of the decade, the picture had changed. Charles and Diana increasingly lived separate professional and social lives. Their public appearances could still look composed, but the private relationship was becoming harder to sustain. Their children, William and Harry, were growing up inside that atmosphere. This is where the familiar royal story becomes too simple. It is easy to reduce the marriage to a triangle involving Charles, Diana, and Camilla. That explanation contains an important part of the history, but it does not explain the full breakdown. The marriage was also shaped by incompatible expectations, relentless press attention, institutional pressure, emotional distance, and two people who increasingly struggled to find common ground. The relationship involving Camilla became especially damaging because it gave the public a clear villain and a clear storyline. Yet the deterioration had already become much larger than one person. Charles and Diana were no longer dealing with an ordinary marital disagreement. Their private conflict had become public property. Then the media found a way to turn every private weakness into commercial value. Diana's photographs became extraordinarily valuable. Her movements, friendships, health, arguments, and emotional state could generate headlines. The more attention she received, the more intensely photographers pursued her. The relationship between the princess and the press became complicated. She could use publicity when it served her purposes, while the same machinery could invade her life when she wanted privacy. That contradiction would become central to everything that followed. By the early 1990s, the marriage was no longer merely unhappy. It was being fought through newspapers, television interviews, private recordings, biographies, and carefully controlled public appearances. The public did not simply watch the breakdown. The public consumed it. In 1991, material later associated with Andrew Morton's biography of Diana began exposing details that the palace had previously kept out of public view. The book discussed her emotional struggles, the state of the marriage, and her experience inside the royal household. The story was explosive because it challenged the controlled image of the Princess of Wales. Then came the private telephone recordings. A conversation involving Diana was published in 1992. Another involving Charles and Camilla followed in 1993. Suddenly, the public was hearing intimate material that had never been intended for public consumption. The marriage was no longer being interpreted only through photographs and official statements. Its private humiliation had become part of the news cycle. The pressure reached another turning point in November 1992, when Windsor Castle was damaged by fire. The following month, on 9th December 1992, the separation of Charles and Diana was formally announced. But separation was not divorce. That distinction left the family trapped inside an arrangement that was publicly broken but constitutionally unfinished. Charles remained heir to the throne. Diana remained Princess of Wales. William and Harry remained their children, growing up while their parents' conflict continued to play out in front of the country. Then the television age made the situation even more difficult. Charles gave his 1994 interview to Jonathan Dimbleby and acknowledged that he had been unfaithful after the marriage had irretrievably broken down. The admission changed the public conversation because the heir to the throne had now spoken openly about the collapse of his marriage. Diana's own 1995 Panorama interview went further in a different direction. She discussed the marriage, her struggles, and the existence of another person in it. The broadcast became one of the defining moments of the entire saga. But there was another layer beneath that interview, one that would become crucial decades later. The BBC's later investigation into Martin Bashir's methods found that forged documents had been used to gain access to Diana through her brother, Charles Spencer. The Dyson inquiry concluded in 2021 that Bashir had acted deceitfully and that the BBC's earlier investigation had been seriously inadequate. The finding did not erase the problems inside Charles and Diana's marriage, but it changed the context in which one of its most consequential public moments had occurred. That distinction is essential. The marriage had real problems before the interview. The later investigation does not prove that every aspect of the relationship was fabricated. What it does establish is that deception was used to obtain access to Diana, and that the BBC failed to properly investigate what had happened at the time. For William, that history has a different meaning because he was not an outside observer. He was a child inside the family when the marriage deteriorated, and that is the point the public often misses. A royal photograph can preserve a smile. It cannot preserve what happened immediately before the shutter opened or what happened after the family returned home. William grew up while his parents' relationship was being dismantled in public. He watched the arguments become headlines. He watched his mother become one of the most recognizable women in the world. He watched his father face public scrutiny, and eventually, he watched the marriage end. That history helps explain why any later statement from William about his parents carries more weight than another commentator revisiting old headlines. The question is not whether Charles and Diana had problems. That has never seriously been in doubt. The question is how those problems looked from inside the family. And that is exactly where the story becomes more uncomfortable. Because once William's own childhood memories enter the discussion, the old royal narrative stops being a story about two adults who failed to make a marriage work. It becomes a story about two children who had to live with the consequences. And if you believe those children deserve to have their side of the history heard, instead of buried beneath decades of royal image management, prove it with one simple action. Like this video, share it, and stay with this story, because the next part turns from public history to what William allegedly remembered inside the family. The most difficult part of William's story was never the wedding photographs, the newspaper headlines, or the arguments that became public. It was what happened after the cameras disappeared. By the time the marriage was breaking apart, William was old enough to understand that something was wrong, but still young enough to be caught between two worlds. Outside the palace, millions of people were debating Charles and Diana. Inside the family, William and Harry had to live with the consequences of that conflict without having any control over it. That difference matters. The public could change the channel. William could not. The source material behind this story places particular importance on the fear, isolation, and emotional pressure surrounding Diana during her final years. It also connects William's later public criticism of the Panorama interview to what he remembered witnessing as a child. That connection is important because it moves the discussion away from royal gossip and toward the lasting effect of the conflict on the people who actually lived through it. One of the most controversial chapters began before William was old enough to understand the machinery surrounding his mother. Diana had become intensely suspicious of people around her. Claims circulated that telephones were being monitored, that members of staff could not be trusted, and that information about her movements was reaching outsiders. Some of those fears were later examined in the investigation into Martin Bashir's conduct. The Dyson inquiry established that Bashir had used false documents to gain access to Diana through her brother, Charles Spencer. It also found that Bashir had given Diana misleading information about people around her. The BBC's earlier internal investigation failed to properly uncover what had happened. That finding matters because it complicates one of the oldest assumptions surrounding Diana. For years, members of the public had been encouraged to view her fears as evidence that she was becoming increasingly unstable. But the later investigation demonstrated that at least some of the information placed in front of her had been deliberately false. That does not mean every fear she expressed was justified. It does mean the environment around her was more complicated than the old shorthand suggested. And William was there. He was not reading about the story decades later from a history book. He was growing up, while his mother's relationship with the palace, the press, and the people around her was becoming increasingly difficult. Then came Panorama. The program was broadcast on 20th November 1995. Diana spoke publicly about the breakdown of her marriage and the pressure surrounding her life inside the royal family. Millions watched. For the monarchy, the broadcast was devastating. For Diana, it became one of the defining moments of her public life. For William, it became something else. It became part of the history of his childhood. And that distinction becomes crucial when considering the later statements attributed to him. The issue was not simply that Diana had spoken on television. She had already been the subject of countless stories, photographs, books, and rumors. The deeper issue was that the program had been obtained through methods that were later found to involve serious deception. The BBC eventually commissioned Lord Dyson to investigate. The findings were damning. Bashir had used forged bank statements to persuade Charles Spencer that people connected to his family were receiving money for information. The documents were not genuine. They were created to make the story appear credible and to persuade Diana's brother to facilitate an introduction. That introduction happened. The interview followed, and the consequences lasted for decades. William's later reaction to the findings was unusually direct. He said the interview should never be broadcast again. He criticized the methods used to obtain it and linked the failures surrounding the interview to the fear, paranoia, and isolation he remembered from his mother's final years. That statement changes the emotional temperature of the entire story, because William was no longer simply defending his mother as an adult royal. He was describing the mother he remembered. The distinction is easy to miss. A public figure can issue a statement because advisors recommend it. A royal can speak because a communications team decides the timing is useful. But the language surrounding William's response carried the weight of personal memory. The controversy also created a difficult question. If Diana had genuine problems inside her marriage, why does the deception surrounding the interview matter so much? Because two things can be true at once. The marriage could have been deeply troubled, and Diana could also have been manipulated by people who wanted access to her. Those realities do not cancel each other out. They make the story more complicated, and complexity is exactly what the public version of royal history often struggles to preserve. The easiest version of the Charles and Diana story is a triangle. Charles loved Camilla. Diana suffered. The marriage collapsed. The public watched. But William's perspective introduces another layer. A child does not experience a marriage as a newspaper headline. A child experiences the atmosphere. He sees the distance between his parents. He notices when conversations stop when he enters a room. He notices when one parent becomes upset. He notices when adults behave differently because someone is watching. Those experiences do not disappear simply because the children grow older. And William eventually became the adult who could speak about what those years meant to him. That is why the alleged confirmation at the center of this story carries such emotional force. If William is now said to have described his parents' marriage as far more hostile behind closed doors than the public understood, the significance is not that he discovered some secret yesterday. It is that an adult version of William may finally be putting words around experiences that began when he was a child. Catherine's alleged support then becomes important for another reason. William would not be approaching this history as an isolated member of the family. Catherine is part of his adult life. She has watched him become a husband, a father, and the future king. She has also seen how the history of his parents continues to follow him. If she supported his decision to revisit the subject, that would suggest the issue had moved beyond private family memory. It would mean William was prepared to acknowledge publicly what he believed his childhood had actually been like. And that is where the story becomes dangerous for the carefully managed royal narrative. Because acknowledging pain is one thing, naming its consequences is another. The monarchy has survived wars, divorces, scandals, constitutional crises, and personal tragedies. What it struggles with most is uncontrolled interpretation. Once William speaks from personal memory, nobody else can completely define what those years meant for him. The palace cannot speak for the child he once was. Charles cannot rewrite the memories of his son, and Camilla cannot erase the history simply because decades have passed. That is why the discussion surrounding Diana remains so emotionally charged. Her death ended her ability to explain herself. William survived long enough to become a senior member of the institution that once surrounded his mother. That creates a strange reversal. The child who once watched the adults control the story eventually became an adult capable of challenging parts of that story himself. And the BBC investigation gave that challenge another foundation. For years, questions surrounding the Panorama interview existed alongside the broader story of Diana's emotional struggles. After the Dyson report, there was an official finding that the journalist had used deceitful methods and that the BBC had failed to investigate those methods properly when it first had the opportunity. That did not prove every allegation about Diana's marriage. It did not transform every rumor into fact, but it did establish that part of the machinery surrounding one of the most important moments in her public life had been seriously compromised. For William, that was not an abstract media scandal. It concerned his mother. It concerned the period when he was growing up, and it concerned a program that became permanently attached to the history of his parents' marriage. That is why the alleged renewed discussion with Catherine beside him carries so much weight in this narrative. It suggests that William is not simply looking backward. He may be trying to decide what version of the past should be carried forward. And once that decision is made, the consequences reach beyond Diana. They reach Charles. They reach Camilla. They reach the monarchy William will eventually inherit. That is the point at which the story stops being about what happened 30 or 40 years ago and starts becoming a question about the future. Because if William believes that the public never understood the full severity of what happened inside his parents' marriage, then remaining silent is no longer neutral. Silence itself becomes a choice. And if Catherine is truly supporting him in that decision, then the next question becomes impossible to avoid. What exactly does William believe the public still has wrong? That is the question hanging over everything that followed. And it is also the question that brings Camilla directly into the center of the story. If you believe powerful families should not be allowed to bury painful truths simply because the truth is uncomfortable, then do not just listen quietly. Like this video, share it, and stay here, because the next part brings the spotlight directly onto Camilla and the past she may have hoped would remain safely behind her. Camilla was not the beginning of Charles and Diana's story, but she became inseparable from the way that story was remembered. For decades, public discussion of the marriage has often returned to one central question: what role did Camilla play in its collapse? The answer has never been as simple as the headlines made it appear. Charles and Diana's relationship had already developed serious problems, but Charles's continuing attachment to Camilla became one of the most painful parts of Diana's experience and one of the most damaging elements of the public narrative. Camilla therefore inherited something larger than controversy. She inherited a history. When the marriage ended, that history did not disappear. Diana remained a global figure whose memory continued to shape public attitudes toward the royal family. Charles eventually rebuilt his public life with Camilla. Their relationship became official, and eventually, Camilla became queen. But becoming queen did not erase the woman whose name had been attached to the story from the beginning. Diana remained part of the emotional landscape. That is why any alleged private discussion involving William, Catherine, Charles, and the history of the first marriage would carry consequences far beyond an ordinary family disagreement. William is not simply Charles's son, he is Diana's son. That distinction has followed him throughout his adult life. He has spoken publicly about his mother, supported projects connected to her legacy, and continued to carry memories of a woman whose life became one of the most examined stories of the modern monarchy. His position gives him a unique place in the argument because he cannot discuss Diana as though she were merely a historical figure. She was his mother, and that makes the alleged confirmation in this story especially sensitive. If William is said to have acknowledged that his parents' marriage was far more hostile behind closed doors than the public understood, the implication is not automatically that every accusation made against Charles was true. It means something narrower and potentially more powerful, that William's understanding of the emotional environment inside the family may be different from the simplified version repeated for decades. That distinction matters. A child can remember tension without knowing every cause. A family can contain painful truths without every story told about it being true. It is the question of memory that gives this account its real force. What did William actually experience? What did he understand at the time? And what did he only understand years later? If William was speaking from personal recollection, then Camilla would be hearing the history from the son of the woman whose marriage to Charles defined so much of her own public life. That is a very different kind of confrontation. It is also why Catherine's presence matters within the account. Catherine is not part of the original marriage. She did not live through the 1980s conflict as a member of the family. She entered William's life much later. Her significance comes from what she represents now, the person beside the future king, as he decides which parts of his family history should remain private and which parts deserve acknowledgement. If she supported William's position, then the story becomes less about a disagreement between generations and more about a decision by the next generation. That is a serious shift. The older generation lived through the scandal. The younger generation inherited its consequences. And William now occupies the unusual position of being both a son shaped by that history and the future monarch who will eventually inherit the institution surrounding it. And there is another reason the timing matters. William is no longer the boy standing behind his parents at public ceremonies. He is now a future king preparing for his own reign personally. Any decision to describe his childhood differently, therefore, carries institutional consequences. It can influence how the next generation understands Charles, Diana, Camilla, and the years that shaped William himself. That creates a pressure no ordinary family has to manage. A private family memory can remain private in most families. A royal family does not have that luxury. Every statement can become history. Every silence can be interpreted. Every photograph can become evidence for a public narrative. And every attempt to correct the past can create a new controversy. This is why the alleged discussion is potentially so damaging to the carefully balanced image surrounding Charles and Camilla. All it requires is a different description of what William remembers. Once that happens, the audience begins asking new questions. Was the marriage only unhappy, or was the household atmosphere more severe than the public understood? How much did the children know? How much did they understand? And how much did the adults believe they could shield them from? Those questions cannot be answered simply by looking at old photographs. They require memory. They require context. And they require an uncomfortable acknowledgement that children often experience family breakdown without having the language to explain it at the time. Because whatever private feelings she may have had about Diana, the public history surrounding their names has never completely separated them. Camilla eventually became part of the institution. Diana became part of its history. William became part of both. And that is why the alleged tears matter within the narrative. They symbolize more than sadness. They represent the possibility that an old chapter has suddenly become present again. The account suggests that Camilla was confronted with a painful version of Charles's past that could no longer be separated from William's own experience. But there is a crucial point that must not be lost. There is no reliable basis in the supplied material for treating a specific recent confrontation between William, Catherine, and Camilla as an established event. The account is presented as an allegation. The documented history is broader. Charles and Diana's troubled marriage, William's childhood within that family, the controversy over the Panorama interview, and the later findings concerning Martin Bashir. That distinction makes the story stronger, not weaker. Because the real question does not depend on inventing a private conversation. It depends on what William has already said publicly about his mother and the circumstances surrounding the interview that shaped part of the public memory of her final years. The Dyson findings gave that history a new layer. The BBC admitted serious failures. The interview was condemned. William publicly opposed its continued broadcast. And suddenly, a story that had been treated for years as a settled piece of royal history became something that required reconsideration. That is the pressure now sitting behind the alleged emotional reaction. If William's position is understood as a demand for a more honest account of his childhood, then Camilla's place in the story becomes unavoidable, even if nobody directly attacks her. Because the past does not need permission to return, it only needs someone willing to remember it. And if William and Catherine are genuinely prepared to revisit that history, then the next question is far more dangerous than whether Camilla was upset. It is whether the royal family can control the story once William starts telling it from his own perspective. Because the next revelation does not concern what the public saw. It concerns what the family may have believed the public should never see. If this story matters to you because you believe William deserves the right to speak about his own childhood, do not sit silently while the old narrative is repeated for another generation. Like, share, and stay with this video, because the next part takes this story from Camilla's reaction to the one question that could change how the entire marriage is remembered. The question left hanging over the family was no longer whether Charles and Diana had suffered, That part of the history has been public for decades. The harder question was whether the people who lived through it were finally ready to describe its consequences without protecting the image of the institution. That is what gives this story its final turn. Camilla's reported tears are not the conclusion. They are the symbol of a much larger collision between the past and the present. If the account behind this story is accurate, William was not trying to settle an old argument or reopen a rivalry with his father's wife. He was confronting the version of his childhood that he believed needed to be understood from the inside. That changes the meaning of the title. Camilla breaks down in tears is the emotional headline. William and Catherine confirm is the real pressure point. And Charles's marriage being described as far nastier is the unresolved question sitting underneath both. Because there is a difference between saying a marriage failed and acknowledging what that failure did to the children inside it. William was one of those children. He grew up knowing that the public saw one family while the private reality was far more complicated. The photographs showed formal appearances, celebrations, school events, and carefully managed smiles. They could not show every silence, every disagreement, or every moment when a child sensed that something between his parents was wrong. That is why William's later perspective carries unusual weight. He has had decades to understand what he saw. He has had time to compare childhood memories with public records, media accounts, and the later findings surrounding the Panorama interview. He has also had to watch the people connected to that history continue living inside the institution that shaped his childhood. And now he is preparing to inherit that institution. For a private citizen, refusing to discuss painful family history is a personal decision. For a future king, every decision about what to acknowledge can become part of the historical record. Catherine's alleged support therefore matters for a reason that goes beyond loyalty between husband and wife. If she encouraged William to acknowledge his own experience, she would be supporting a different approach to royal history, not the version designed only to protect appearances, but one that accepts that personal pain can exist alongside public duty. That does not make every rumor about Charles and Diana true. It does not prove every private allegation ever published. It does not establish the exact conversation described in the claim behind this video, but it does explain why the subject remains powerful. The documented history already shows a marriage under enormous pressure, a public separation, competing accounts, intense media intrusion, and a later investigation that found serious deception surrounding the interview that became one of the defining moments of Diana's final years. The rest belongs to the realm of allegation and interpretation. That distinction should remain clear. Yet even with that caution, one fact remains impossible to ignore. The people who were children during the collapse of that marriage eventually became adults with their own memories. William cannot be separated from Diana's story because he was her son. He cannot be separated from Charles's story because he is his son. And he cannot completely escape Camilla's place in that history because she became his father's wife and eventually his queen. Those connections were created long before William had any control over them. Now he has a voice. The boy who once had to watch adults manage an impossible family situation became the man who could decide what he was willing to say about it. And that is why reopening the subject can feel threatening even without a dramatic confrontation. Truth does not need a shouting match to cause discomfort. For Camilla, the emotional weight would come from knowing that the past she inherited is still attached to the memories of the children who lived through it. Her position today may be entirely different from the one she occupied during Charles's first marriage, but history does not always respect the boundaries people create around it. That is why the story cannot honestly end with tears. The tears, if the reported account is accurate, would only show that the subject still hurts. The more important question is what happens after the emotion passes. Does the family acknowledge the pain? Does the institution allow a more complicated history to exist? Can William speak about his childhood without being accused of attacking his father? Can Catherine support him without being drawn into another royal battle? And can Camilla face the past without being reduced to the villain of a story that was always more complicated than one person? Those questions matter because the monarchy is now approaching a generational change. The people who once controlled the narrative are no longer the only people able to speak. William's generation has inherited the consequences of decisions made before it had a voice. That generation can choose silence, or it can choose acknowledgement. And acknowledgement does not have to mean revenge. It can mean recognizing that public history is never complete when the people at its center were unable or unwilling to tell the whole story. The final issue is not who wins the argument, but whether the family can acknowledge what the children endured. That is the deeper reason this alleged confirmation matters. Not because it gives the public another reason to attack Camilla. Not because it turns Charles and Diana into heroes and villains. And not because every rumor surrounding the royal family deserves belief. It matters because William's perspective forces the audience to look at the marriage through the eyes of the child who survived its collapse. That is a harder story to simplify. And perhaps that is why this subject continues to return. Diana's death ended her life. But the emotional consequences did not end with any of those events. They continued through William's adulthood, through his relationship with the monarchy, through his memories of his mother, and through the way he has responded when later evidence challenged the story surrounding her final years. So when the headline says Camilla broke down, the real question should not be whether she cried. The real question is what she was being asked to confront. If the alleged discussion forced her to hear William's understanding of his parents' marriage without the usual distance of palace language, then the emotion would make sense as a human reaction to a painful history. But it would not settle the history. Only honesty can do that. And honesty begins by separating what is documented from what is alleged. The documented record tells us that Charles and Diana's marriage was deeply troubled. It tells us that their private lives became a worldwide media spectacle. It tells us that William and Harry were children during the collapse. It tells us that the BBC later investigated the methods used to obtain Diana's panorama interview, and that serious wrongdoing was found. The alleged account goes further. It claims that William and Catherine recently confronted an even harsher understanding of the marriage, and that Camilla was emotionally overwhelmed by it. That specific confrontation remains a claim, not an established fact. But the question it raises is real. How much of a family's private pain should survive in silence simply because the family is royal? That is where the story leaves William, not as a son seeking revenge, not as a future king trying to rewrite history, but as an adult deciding whether the memories of his childhood should be allowed to exist alongside the official record. And perhaps that is the part worth remembering when the headlines disappear. A royal family can control ceremonies. It can control schedules. It can manage statements. But it cannot control what its members remember. If you believe that truth should not be buried simply to protect an image, subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, like this video, and share it with someone who follows these stories, because refusing to look away is the only way these hidden chapters keep getting examined, and the next video coming on this channel goes even deeper into the royal history that powerful people would rather leave untouched.